Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Baldwin, and I'm the current program in early American economy and society postdoctoral fellow at the Library Company of Philadelphia. If this is your first time attending a Library Company of Philadelphia event, we are so happy that you could join us. If you've attended another one of our programs, welcome back. And for those who may not be familiar, the Library Company was founded in 1731, and it's an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, and broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. To that end, we host a wide range of free public programming, which brings us all here this evening. So launched in 2020 when the Library Company was physically closed due to COVID-19, our Fireside chat series continues as a platform that sustains and celebrates our diverse community of fellows, scholars, librarians, readers, and lifelong learners. Each chat highlights the extraordinary work of researchers who have drawn on the rich collections of the Library Company, and tonight is no different. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome former fellow Dr. Michael A. Verney, who will be presenting on his recent book, Our Great and Rising Nation, Naval Expansion and Global Empire in the Early U.S. As a reminder, if you have questions during the presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A function, the chat function, at the bottom of your screens throughout the event. At the end of the event, I will make sure to read those questions and give Dr. Verney a chance to answer them. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Verney. Dr. Michael A. Verney grew up in the woods of Western Massachusetts, where he cultivated a love of history, exploration, writing, and the natural world. He earned his BA from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2008, and his MA and PhD from the University of New Hampshire in 2011 and 2016, respectively. Dr. Verney's research examines the global history of the early U.S. Republic, with a focus on maritime expansion, encounters, and empire. He's currently working on his second book project, which is a joint analysis of Commodore Matthew Perry's Japan expedition and the North Pacific expedition of 1853-1856. Without further ado, Dr. Verney.
Okay. Well, good evening to all of you. And Chris, thank you very much for that introduction and congrats on your fellowship. The Library Company is lucky to have you. I want to thank Allison for the invitation to speak and thank all of you for coming to join this conversation this evening. I had a wonderful postdoctoral fellowship through the National Endowment for the Humanities at the Library Company between January and July of 2018. And at that time, I was doing research to turn the dissertation into this book that I'm going to be presenting on tonight. And it was a very, very precious and memorable experience for me. So I'm really delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to engage the Library Company once again. It's deeply meaningful. I'm not sure who's joining us tonight in terms of the staff whom I knew when I was there, but if we cross paths, I'm very happy to have you here, and I hope to hear from you after the talk. And so for this talk, I'm especially excited to tell you a little bit about the origins of the book, some of the core ideas of the book, and I want to also introduce you to some of the interesting characters who kind of feature into it. Let me share my screen for all of you so you can see. Here's the cover here. For all of the presentations that I've attended when people talk about their books or their research, I've always appreciated hearing scholars' stories about the backstory for their projects, kind of the history behind the history. So that's what I'm going to be doing here, and I thought I'd start with my own. If we rewind back, and Chris and probably many of the audience will remember this period, to the troubled or the torturous days of graduate school when I had passed my comprehensive exams at the University of New Hampshire and I was casting about for a dissertation topic. And one of the leading contenders was to examine the antebellum U.S. Navy's global exploring expeditions. And it turns out there are many of these. We don't often think of the U.S. Navy as being a force for exploration, especially in that early period. But nonetheless, between 1830 and 1860, the Navy dispatched 17 voyages of discovery around the world, and they varied greatly in size and scope, but they visited or traversed every major ocean and continent from all throughout the Pacific world, Ottoman Palestine, from the Arctic to Antarctica, and from West Africa throughout Latin America. So we see this quite a frenzy, really, of naval activity going around the world in this period. And I really wanted to understand what was driving this activity. And I was particularly interested in the political and the cultural origins of these voyages. And so I was thinking about this topic, and in reviewing the scholarly literature, I was really pretty happy to find that while there were some scholars and some journalistic historians who had written books or articles that focused on one or two of these expeditions individually, very few had really tried to tackle all of them collectively and try to understand what they say about the United States in this early period as a collective phenomenon. And particularly, I thought they could say something significant about the global nature of U.S. empire in the age of manifest destiny. And so as a new historian embarking on this particular adventure of sort of researching and writing what would become this book, I came across a quote by D.W. Meinig from volume 2 of his series, The Shaping of America, that I want to share with you that I think has been very influential in my thinking about expansionism in this period. And in that volume, he says, U.S. expansion is not simply and I quote, westward movement by a government and people across the continent, but of an outward movement, putting pressure on the borderlands to the north and south, as well as thrusting westward and ranging out to sea to place islands and coastlines near and far under American commercial, cultural, demographic, and political influence, end quote there. And I found that very much framed and explained, particularly that last part of the U.S. ranging outward to across the oceans was something that we very much see happening at the U.S. Navy. I was also conscious at the time, and continue to be, of a growing scholarship about U.S. global imperialism in the early republic, basically the period from 1776 until about 1860 or 61. But many of these studies were really focused on private actors, missionaries or merchants, working class sailors, and none of these works were concerned with sort of arguing that the federal government itself was deeply invested in a form of global empire. And these are all wonderful works. These are all friends of mine, and I recommend all of these titles. But I saw an opening as a scholar to make an argument about the place of the federal government in global empire, particularly because the conventional wisdom is that, at least in terms of the federal government did not invest in global empire, at least in terms of sort of formal state-directed empire, until the period of the 1890s. And in the 1890s, this audience may very likely know that during the Spanish-American War and its aftermath in 1898, 1899, and 1900, the United States defeated Spain and then seized several of its overseas possessions, especially the Philippines, but also Guam and Puerto Rico, to form this empire. This is what we see with what the overseas U.S. empire looked like in 1899. And really, there continues to be violence throughout. This empire is inherently violent, but it takes quite a long time before the U.S. is able to suppress a patriot resistance in the Philippines after 1898 and after 1899. So I suspected that the story that we see here is really only half the story. That there's something that's happening much earlier, and that these voyages of discovery dispatched by a branch of the federal government can really sort of underscore that earlier story and give some substance to it. And that is going to be, and was, one of the big claims of the book, in fact, that the federal government pursued and established a global empire far earlier than is conventionally thought. So I saw an opening in terms of historiography. I felt like there was a story that hadn't been told before. And then there are a number of other things that really intrigued me about this topic. One was that these voyages seemed incredibly European in their construction, their rhetoric, their activities, etc. And especially they seem so British. Here we have an image of the official portrait of Captain James Cook. Captain Cook helped establish the tradition of Royal Navy exploration in the late 18th century. And then the Lords of the Admiralty would strengthen it after his death, and especially after the end of the Napoleonic Wars after 1815. And in fact, the Royal Navy was the primary instrument of Western global exploration until about 1850, at which point so many of the world's oceans and major rivers had been surveyed that it was largely the dry interiors of such continents as Africa, Australia, that remained incognito to the Western world. And that's where we get folks like David Livingstone or Henry Morton Stanley. They kind of come to prominence in that period. So this interested me because at the same time as U.S. Navy appeared to be mimicking the Royal Navy in undertaking voyages that are very much like the ones that Cook undertook in the Pacific, there's all this intense Anglophobia in U.S. politics and U.S. rhetoric, especially once we see it to the ascendancy of Jeffersonian, then later Jacksonian democracy. There's a lot of pride, an emphasis, rhetorically at least, on the distinctiveness of the United States versus the British Empire and Europe more generally. So that intrigued me. And then finally, when looking at this topic, I found that there's a wonderful narrative arc because the story begins with failure. It begins with President John Quincy Adams, poor President John Quincy Adams, tried to do so much. But in December of 1825, one of the things that he tries to do in his first annual message to Congress is that he wants the U.S. Navy to be dispatched on a European-style voyage of discovery to the Pacific Ocean. And there's quite a period of lobbying and political intrigue that culminates in the House passing a bill. Amazing, the House passing a bill. The House passes a bill that sends the Navy to explore the South Pacific in 1828, but then the measure ends up being blocked in the Senate. And therefore, of course, it doesn't come to pass. So 1825, 1829, there's this movement, political movement, but it ends in failure. But if we fast forward to the presidency of Millard Fillmore, and you can all be shocked for a moment that you're hearing about the presidency of Millard Fillmore, but Millard Fillmore, his Secretary of the Navy, John Pendleton Kennedy, who you see here, this is a nice sketch of him. By the time that he's serving as the head of the Navy Department between July of 1852 and March of 1853, Kennedy either inherits or organizes 6 naval exploring expeditions to the Arctic, to Nicaragua, to the Amazon and Rio de la Plata, to West Africa on behalf of the colonizationist movement, and also the North Pacific exploring expedition to China, Japan, and Russia. And that's what I'm currently researching here. This is an image that shows you the various vessels for that squadron. This last one that Kennedy helped to organize was 5 ships. It was over 400 officers and men. It was not only far larger than most contemporary European expeditions, which tended to be 1 or 2 vessels, but it appears to have been the largest Western voyage of discovery ever dispatched by any Western power up until that time. And it was the U.S. Navy. It was its expedition all around the North Pacific Rim, especially Japan there. And they're arriving in Japan right after Perry is there with the Treaty of Kanagawa. So they're trying to sort of push the Treaty of Kanagawa, and they're surveying and charting the entire Japanese coastline. So it's a pretty interesting expedition that's virtually untouched in terms of scholarship. And notably, I mentioned Perry's expedition, the 6 expeditions that Kennedy inherited or organized, that doesn't include Matthew Calvert Perry's very famous expedition to Japan, which was not technically an exploring expedition, even though it did undertake a little bit of surveying and cartography while they were in Japanese ports. So what that means, to go back to Kennedy here for a moment, by the 1850s, the U.S. Navy Department is looking a lot like the British Admiralty. It's really kind of intriguing. So, of course, this raises the question of what happens between the time of John Quincy Adams in the 1820s and then by the time that you get this massive expedition to chart the entire North Pacific Rim. Something happened. And my answer for this is really deceptively simple. Here, actually, I might go back to the cover for you. The answer is basically that naval exploration became more popular with more and more segments of white U.S. society. empire investing in these kinds of things, it's hard work. It's hardest on those who are imperialized and those who are colonized and terrorized and bloodied by empires. But it also requires a pretty significant investment of blood and treasure and energy from within itself. And so therefore, empire is often kind of a product that needs to be sold at home first before it can be pursued abroad. And so in this project, the main characters of the book are folks whom I call explorationists, and here's some of them here. These are supporters of U.S. naval exploration. They were incredibly passionate, but they're not especially popular. They tended to either be middle-class or mid-ranking naval officers, or they'd be governing elites, people like John Quincy Adams, presidents, secretaries of state, high-ranking diplomats, secretaries of the Navy, members of Congress, etc. And collectively, this group can be called honor hawks in the sense that they were deeply concerned with honor and of character on both an individual and a national level. And in particular, they really craved European recognition and esteem. They're proud to be Americans, they're proud of the United States, but recent scholarship has really kind of shown that actually there's quite a bit of diffidence that's existing underneath all of the some braggadocious, bombastic rhetoric that we see for early American nationalism. So when you think about the United States and its formation, the American Revolution really had two goals. The first goal, of course, is independence, is home rule. But the second goal is equality. They want to be equal with the great powers of Europe. And so if we go back here, these are some of the titles, by the way, including my mentor's work, Elijah Gould, in regards to a certain amount of diffidence that Americans had in the post-revolutionary period. But if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson is really pretty clear about this in the sense that it was time for the fledgling nation, and I quote, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So separation, but equality. And separation came faster, and in some ways easier, than international equality. But in order for the United States to achieve parity with the great powers of Europe, they had to become kind of a great imperial power themselves. And if we look at sort of what constituted being a great power in the Western world in the 19th century, there were three basic attributes. One was what I call developmental strength, that great powers had to have strong, booming economies. You had to have a robust commercial system. You had to have a powerful military. That could be predominantly sea power, like in the case of the British, it could be predominantly land power, but you had to have that power element, both economically and militarily. You had to be recognized as being culturally sophisticated by European standards in terms of contributions to Western art and science, politeness, cultural institutions, etc. And then thirdly, you had to have diplomatic recognition as a great power by another great power. And this last qualification often came with the expectation of playing sort of balance of power politics in Europe and the Mediterranean, the Ottoman world. You can imagine, this group is pretty informed of these kinds of things. U.S. citizens were generally suspicious of large standing militaries, even navies. It takes a very long time to found the U.S. Naval Academy, actually for that reason, in 1845. And furthermore, there was little appetite for intervening directly in European or Ottoman affairs. There was also a lot of cost consciousness, a lot of frugality that we see being expressed by early U.S. leaders and citizens. So there are some limitations to this. But what seemed apparent to me as I did the research for this is that most white U.S. citizens appeared to have wanted the respect that the great powers of Europe afforded to each other. So in essence, they wanted European recognition as a great power without having to act on some of the chief requirements of great powerhood. And it seemed for them, for these explorationists, to go back to them, dispatching the U.S. Navy on a career of global discovery seemed to be an ideal vehicle for achieving cultural parity of European states. And largely because that was one of the more visible activities of the great powers in the public eye. These exploring expeditions culturally were kind of similar to the space race. for those in the middle of the 20th century. Very similar kind of dynamics in terms of immense amount of public enthusiasm for an awful lot of coverage about in the media these kinds of Navy exploring expeditions. In particular, these explorationists thought that a naval voyage of discovery would allow the United States to lay claim to that second component, to a kind of Western civilizational maturity in European capitals, especially by making contributions to the transnational empire of science. And other historians have tackled this concept too. I kind of define that as being this imperial but transnational space that could be appreciated through myriad forms, through lectures, through publications. Universities and museums would contribute to it and be part of it. Artifacts, specimens, technologies, methodologies. It's this space of knowledge that is ideally shared amongst really all of humanity, is the rhetoric that we see in the period, but nonetheless is one in which there's an awful lot of competition as well, where individuals and nations and institutions could sort of joust with each other for prestige. So these explorationists say we can make a contribution in this area. We don't really want to have a big navy or a big army. We don't really want to get involved, especially with the Monroe Doctrine, in European or Ottoman affairs. But we can probably send the Navy out to explore for science and for commerce and for other reasons, as you'll hear. So what that means in this context is that these naval voyage of discovery in the United States, they originate as a form of cultural diplomacy to Europe. That's where they sort of flower from. But then after that, especially the experience of 1829, teaches the individuals you see here that appeals to sort of national prestige to the empire of science are not going to be enough on their own. It can get a bill through the House, but it can't get through the Senate. It can't actually literally embark. So therefore, what ends up happening in terms of this idea of them becoming more popular is that explorationists learn that their expeditions need to be practical and utilitarian. And so this European imperial strategy had to be kind of republicanized or kind of Americanized in this North American cultural context. So therefore, the solution ends up being kind of this mixture of pragmatism with promises of glory. And so explorationists begin proposing expeditions that appeal directly to the interests of key domestic constituencies. And this kind of gets to one of the framing of the book, is that I argue that antebellum US expansionism or imperialism was multidimensional. And conveniently, I can liken it, and I do in the book, I liken it to a kraken, tentacles of a kraken. There isn't one empire. There were many empires, many different imperial impulses that sort of snuck out into the world. We see in terms of sort of the West, a kind of territorial Republican or Federalist, Jefferson's Empire of Liberty in the North American West, and also the South with Florida there. Florida's kind of part of Westward expansion. We see a sort of an evangelical Empire of Christ, especially through missionary work. We see a mercantile empire, a global empire of commerce, and then also this transnational but Eurocentric, ultimately, empire of science as well. And these tentacles, I suggest, aren't always in harmony either. Sometimes they're actually vying against each other. Those who are in favor of commercial expansion sometimes appreciate what missionaries are doing, but more frequently, missionaries don't really appreciate what commercial expansionists are seeking to do. And I suggest that, not particularly a novel suggestion, but even the US Civil War can be really conceived as being these two expansionist impulses, one pro-slavery, one freed labor clashing. And in that moment, the antebellum beast of the Kraken was kind of torn asunder into a new country. So each chapter of this book kind of discusses this process of conversion, whereby more and more constituents in the white body politic kind of bought into this idea that, yeah, the Navy should go out and explore the world, particularly if they're going to advance my interests. So for the rest of this talk, now that I've kind of framed what the book is about and kind of the big ideas for it, I'd like to kind of discuss the origins of this explorationist impulse, and then discuss how it transformed from being an empire of science an effort to support an empire of science into being more of an empire of commerce. And so we'll go back to John Quincy Adams here. Here we have another image of him at the beginning of his presidency. Adams, interestingly enough, thought very highly of Cook. And we know this of him, that he loved the natural sciences, especially astronomy, but also botany. And he loved being out in nature. And in many ways, if his father hadn't steered him in a very particular direction, he probably would have gone into that as a natural scientist. So Cook fits really well into that. And Adams, of course, not only admired Cook, but all kinds of European explorers. He spent enough time in Europe as a diplomat to develop a deep admiration for scientific voyages of discovery. So, for example, there's a period where he's serving as U.S. minister to St. Petersburg. And in 1810, he visits with a very famous Russian admiral, Admiral Adam Johann von Krusenstern, who was at the helm of Russia's very first circumnavigation of the world. It's happening actually at about the same time as the Lewis and Clark expedition. Here we have a beautiful engraving, colored engraving of that. We have the Russian superboard Neva there. This is off Kodiak Island. And this is unfolding about 1803, 1806. Krusenstern comes back to Russia, and Adams meets him and has a very, very inspirational sort of meeting with him. So if we fast forward to Adams becoming president, achieving his father's ambition for him, he's giving his first annual message to Congress in December of 1825. And it's an incredibly ambitious annual message, especially for the antebellum period. He would very famously define the purpose of government, let's go back to Adams here, as, quote, the improvement of the condition of those who are parties to the social compact. And in that, he would propose using Western land sales to pay for internal improvements. He wanted a national university. He wanted astronomical observatories. He wanted to establish a hemispherical conference with Latin American nations. And then, of course, most importantly for this talk, he also wants to send the Navy on this exploring expedition to the Pacific Ocean. And in this case, he suggests that the Navy should chart the northwest coast of North America there. So Adams cloaked his proposal in some pretty grandiose language. And in fact, his attorney general, reading a draft of this address before it was given, told him that it is excessively bold. You're really pushing things there. But Adams, being the stubborn Adams that he was, didn't want to retreat from his language. So he feted the discovery voyages of European navies as glorious missions that the U.S. had an obligation to repay through its own geographical contributions. And he really waxes poetic and very enthusiastic in his address, which he's giving this time. They didn't come to Congress. They wrote them out, and they were sent over to Congress. So Adams had no shortage of passion or enthusiasm, but nonetheless, he was privately pessimistic about his proposal. He believed that Congress would not act favorably, and he'd be proven right in 1829. But he wanted to put this forward as a distant goal, to put it on the minds of Americans, the minds of American statesmen, that this is where the country will eventually develop and should develop that way. Before that, though, what Adams sought to put forward as this distant goalpost, there's another citizen in the country who set out to make it into a concrete reality during Adams's administration. And this is where we get to meet the central character for chapter 1 of the book, Jeremiah Reynolds. Reynolds is a really interesting character, fascinating figure. And he's particularly interesting to me because his ambition was so great. He wanted to kind of be the American Cook. He wanted to translate Adams' more sort of Eurocentric empire of science into a more rugged, Americanized, masculine, democratic empire of knowledge. And though he tried with great verve, of course, he's going to prove unsuccessful, but he's the first person to push this as hard as anyone else is going to in the book. And he's pretty fascinating in that way. Unfortunately, I don't have an image to show you of Reynolds. I do have some images to show you. He appears to have been painted several times, but none of those have survived. But here's his signature. I'll share this with you. And here, perhaps with all of that underlining and underscoring you see with his name, you can glimpse a sense of his self and a sense of his ambition here. As he once wrote to Adams' Secretary of the Navy, Samuel Southard, quote, "I am not great yet, but will be, and glorious." And then later on, "Give me latitude, and I will strike bold for immortality." So this is this is Chris, and this is every postdoc at the library company here and across the country. He's somebody who really is going to try to lay hold to immortality as best he can, and he sees that his vehicle for doing that is through his passion for voyages of discovery. In the book, I end up actually drawing some comparisons that might interest you between Reynolds and Abraham Lincoln, in fact. Here we have Lincoln as a young congressman about 1846, 1847. And there's actually a lot of parallels between the two men. Both were Midwesterners, or Westerners, as they would be styled at the time. So Reynolds was born in Pennsylvania. There you go. Pennsylvania in 1799, but mostly raised in Ohio. And for Lincoln, of course, born in Kentucky, but then coming of age in Indiana and especially Illinois. Both of these men were Henry Clay Whigs, big supporters of Henry Clay, fellow Westerner. They actively campaigned for Whig presidential candidates. They believed in an activist federal government that could be made to improve things, kind of like what Adams believes. But this is a little bit later. It kind of morphs into this kind of formulation. The Whig Party isn't officially established until a little bit later. Both Reynolds and Lincoln were critical of the Mexican-American War. So they have some limits on how the empire should be extended. But they're both enamored of this Whiggish vision of an active federal government that's involved in improvements. And Lincoln is much more focused locally and domestically, eventually on the abolition of slavery when the Civil War sort of forces his hand on that. Reynolds is more interested in many ways. He's interested in internal improvement, but he's especially passionate about what Daniel Walker Howe has called external improvements. That not only should the federal government invest in roads and canals and create greater forms of communication within the country, but the Navy, as a branch of the federal government, should invest in maritime or naval cartography and make things even safer and better and more improved for American mariners and merchants traveling the world. Both men also loved reading. Reynolds, from a very early age, says, and I quote, "had imbibed a relish for books of voyages and travels when I had not yet seen the ocean," unquote. So he's this young person in Western Pennsylvania and then later in Ohio who's reading about these voyages and wants to partake in them. He's especially inspired by a Prussian baron named Alexander von Humboldt. And von Humboldt had trekked through South America between 1799 and 1803. He actually meets with Jefferson on his return voyage back to Europe. And Humboldt wrote prolifically after his return, publishing all kinds of scientific volumes that were hugely popular on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly because he really combined this romantic writing style with voluminous accounts of nature and scientific data. He's really an incredible figure. We're starting to appreciate him more now. We tend to think of Darwin as being like the leading scientist in the 19th century, and he would be by the end, but in the early period, the first half of the 19th century, it's really Humboldt is the one that everyone's looking up to. And Reynolds is no exception. He sees on Humboldt as a model for his own life, and his theories and his methods and his travels, his adventures were very much inspired by the Prussian scientists. Very famously, Humboldt goes and he summits some volcanoes in South America. And of course, when Reynolds goes in 1834, between 1829 and 1834, he's traveling through South America and eventually the South Pacific. And he summits volcanoes as well in a way that he's very self-consciously replicating Humboldt. So Humboldt admires these sort of scientific European aristocrats, these scientific European luminaries, but he also ends up developing a deep appreciation and admiration for U.S. sailors and for U.S. sealers, people like the men you see here. Here we have a wonderful watercolor from the Nantucket Historical Association. So Reynolds, as he's thinking about this idea of sending the Navy out to explore the Pacific Ocean, he's reading a lot about whalers and sealers. He's meeting whalers and sealers in Nantucket and Massachusetts and Stonington, Connecticut. And he's really feeling that these men have kind of crafted of their own brawn and know-how a kind of working and middle-class masculine empire of knowledge that can be part of a larger, or part of, can be encompass actually, be larger than the empire of science. It can be something that's sort of uniquely American. And in his telling, the South Pacific becomes this heroic realm where brave and hardy men can enrich themselves through the pursuit of dangerous marine life. And he thought of the Pacific as, quote, our field of fame, that no other nation was doing quite as much commercial activity, particularly fisheries activity, as the United States in the South Pacific. And, what's intriguing about this is that we'll see the same kind of a nobilization, especially of whalers, through a man who was very much influenced by Reynolds. And that's going to be, of course, Herman Melville. Melville was deeply influenced by Reynolds. And actually, tell me if this sounds familiar, but in 1839, Reynolds writes a short story about a furious white whale in the South Seas named Mocha Dick, who battled whaleboats that were attacking his harem. And in his version, Mocha Dick dies. But nonetheless, I think you see exactly where Melville would get his inspiration from and then build on it in later years. So Reynolds, what he sought to do is he actually really kind of became, in essence, a de facto agent of Adams's Navy Department. He actually has some meetings with Adams, and Adams is completely thrilled to have him on board and be able to articulate and advocate for sending out this expedition. And he sees that there's this opportunity for the U.S. to capitalize on all these expanding whale and seal fisheries by sending out this naval exploring expedition to sort of build off what they've already been discovering in the South Seas, and also to shore up and protect that very, very profitable field of commerce. But therefore, in doing so, the U.S. can finally be recognized as a fully civilized, by Western standards, Western power by the great powers of Europe. And so Reynolds spends a number of years traveling up and down the Eastern Seaboard, barnstorming, giving lectures, trying to get memorials sent to Congress from various communities, and he's very successful in that. And that eventually culminates in that bill that I told you about earlier, that in May of 1828, the House passes a bill that provides $50,000 for the president to send a warship to examine the South Pacific. But it's in the Senate, however, that Reynolds's vision for this empire of knowledge, this Americanized, democratized vision of an empire of knowledge, building off of the European empire of science, collides with sort of a different imperial notion, the empire of liberty, Jefferson's sense of the empire of liberty. So, of course, the bill is referred to the Naval Affairs Committee in the Senate, and there it met with a cool reception from the chairman of that committee. And that was a South Carolinian slaveholder named Robert Young Hayne, shown here. And later on, he is going to get into a very famous oratorical clash, in case anyone knows about this and is wondering, with Daniel Webster in December of 1829, of Hayne v. Webster fame, over the nature of the Union. That's coming. Not long after, actually, he pounces on this bill. So Hayne had originally been a strong supporter of U.S. naval expansion and U.S. naval activity, U.S. navalism, but his mentor was John C. Calhoun. And by 1829, both Hayne and his mentor Calhoun are beginning to sour on the idea of a strong activist national government, focused on internal improvements, or even in Reynolds' case, of external improvements. And Hayne, he's concerned about cost. He thinks that no single expedition could possibly chart the immensity of the South Pacific. In many ways, he's right on that. And so therefore, he estimates that not only would this voyage cost nearly $500,000, but that successive expeditions would be equally expensive and there's going to be additional revenue that's going to have to be paid, raised to pay those amounts, particularly either through direct taxation or through tariffs or through raising the price of public lands. And South Carolinians like Hayne and Calhoun oppose all three of those. And in fact, when Hayne does have that epic clash with Daniel Webster over the nature of the Union later that year, it would begin with a debate over the pricing and sale of Western territory. So he's already sort of getting to be ideologically opposed to this kind of thing. And then he's also attached to Washington's farewell message. He's attached to the Monroe Doctrine. He's fine of sort of westward expansion. He's fine of sending the Army. There's another crucial context for this. The Army is embarking on all of these exploring expeditions into the West. He's fine of that, but he's looking at Reynolds, who wants to be glorious and wants to have all these foreign adventures. And he really thinks that this is going to lead to a bad place. The U.S. will acquire overseas territories, overseas colonies, and they would eventually find themselves having to create a massive military machine to be able to defend those colonies against expansionist European empires. And then thirdly, a third fear likely animated Hayne, and that's that as the federal government increases in its power, there could be a concern that the federal government might use that power to emancipate enslaved people. And we see that, Nathaniel Macon, a leading old Republican from the period, old Jeffersonian Republican, said, and I quote here, "If Congress can make canals, they can with more propriety emancipate." So he doesn't state that explicitly, of course, but historians, including myself, kind of think that that's probably what's going on. So in February 1829, he recommended that the Senate reject the measure, and a few attempts to revive the bill went nowhere. And so by the time that Andrew Jackson is inaugurated in March of 1829 and has this very big party down in Washington, D.C., after a very hard-fought campaign between Adams and between Jackson, naval exploration appeared dead, and Adams' pessimism appeared correct. So Reynolds is crestfallen. He goes on a private sealing voyage to South America later that year in 1829. But what he kind of found out is that to win over skeptical Republicans like Hayne, even though he had tried to translate this European idea of an empire of science, he's unable to fully convince skeptical Republicans like Hayne. And so therefore, by the time that he returns home from South America in 1834, he had learned how to speak to Jacksonian Democrats about global imperial expansion. And so actually Andrew Jackson himself ends up becoming a big supporter of the very first of these voyages of discovery. It's under his administration that Congress actually passes the bill that leads to the very first of these. And what I suggest in the book, in this second chapter, is that Jacksonian Democrats began to see that naval exploration could support their political economic program, particularly of creating as many economic opportunities for aspiring white men as possible. And I want to note here, we know that actually, these crews are actually quite diverse in the antebellum period, but they still are predominantly white. So in the 1830s, with U.S. maritime activity increasing even exponentially from the 1820s in the Pacific world, we see that explorationists, including Reynolds, who completely changes his tune, really starts emphasizing more of the humanitarian and commercial benefits of naval exploration over its glorious contributions to Western science. And so therefore, rhetorical support for what became the United States exploring expedition was just vastly different from what we saw in the 1820s under Adams and under Reynolds 1.0. So when Jacksonian Democrats joined with Whigs in Congress to vote in favor of a naval voyage of discovery to the Pacific, they were voting primarily for an empire of commerce and only secondarily for an empire of the higher sciences. And so in 1838, the United States exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842 is dispatched to circumnavigate the world, but to pay particular attention to the South Pacific, to Antarctica. This is the flagship, the USS Vincennes, in a wonderful watercolor scene that's at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, off of the Antarctic coastline. and also to actually chart parts of the Northwest, the West Coast of North America, the Northwest, Pacific Northwest region. And this was a pretty massive expedition, 6 ships, about 250 officers and men, and it traversed the South Pacific, the West Coast of North America, collecting scientific specimens and anthropological artifacts. But in particular, they're really focused on science somewhat, but especially commerce. They're forcing indigenous Oceanian societies to accept U.S. commercial activity in their home waters. And they're doing that both through diplomacy. They're signing treaties that the Senate doesn't ratify. They're like Indian treaties, but they're signing treaties with Oceanian powers. And then they're also committing quite a bit of violence to, especially in Fiji in July of 1840, they retaliate for the deaths of 2 officers on the island of Mololo by killing over 100 Fijians. Most importantly, though, the XX is producing these. They're producing charts for navigators, for merchants, and for mariners. So when they come back from the expedition in 1842, they produce 249 charts of islands, island chains, harbors, and submerged reefs that the Treasury Department would then sell at U.S. custom houses for basically the cost of printing and engraving. They really want these out. They want these to be used. So the XX can be kind of conceived as a projection of Jacksonian capitalism and economic governance into the Pacific world. And these charts are really big, a big part of that, but so also are all these treaties and this violence. Later chapters discuss this conversionary process wherein some prominent constituent in the white body politic came to see the benefit of naval exploration for their own imperial interests. So when the XX comes back, and they abbreviated that to XX, they brought all of these scientific specimens back home, and they store them on the second story of the U.S. Patent Office. And it's the first publicly funded museum of natural history in the United States. This is what the interior would have looked like for it. This is later in the 1890s, but still nonetheless, this is kind of what it would look like in the 1840s, 1850s. So that middle chapter is about how naval imperialism, naval explorationism is sold to a curious middle class and a literate middle class. And part of it is by putting the specimens on display. The other part of it is publishing narratives of these adventures around the world, which are enormously popular in this antebellum period. And then later chapters deal with some of the more quirky of these expeditions. One of them was to the Holy Land, to the Ottoman Palestine. In the 1840s, the Navy was sent to explore and chart and survey the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And this is Camp Washington on the shores of the Dead Sea from that expedition. And I think you could imagine that U.S. evangelicals are thrilled by this expedition, particularly because it was sent out to prove that the Old Testament account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was actually accurate, was actually a real story. The 5th chapter of the book takes a much darker turn, but it looks at ways in which pro-slavery expansionists tried to expand slavery, U.S. slavery at least, into South America through naval exploration, especially of the Amazon River basin, but also, I argue, to the Rio de la Plata. There's a very large expedition, a river steamer that goes up the Rio de la Plata, looking at places like Paraguay and Bolivia, trying to see if there are spaces where pro-slavery colonies can be established there. And thank goodness those don't get off the ground, but they're trying. And pro-slavery expansionists are among those who then join this explorationist coalition. And then the final chapter circles back to this question of European esteem or European respect. So in 1845, Sir John Franklin, this Royal Navy explorer, sets out from Britain for ostensibly trying to find the Northwest Passage. There's other arguments about what he's trying to do. And he gets lost in the Arctic. And so in the 1850s, early 1850s, there's an attempt to try to locate Sir John Franklin, mostly on the British side, but also on the U.S. naval side and the U.S. maritime side. In fact, the Navy partners with a New York City merchant named Henry Grinnell to try to go out and to locate Franklin. And the second expedition gets to be particularly famous under the leadership of Alicia Kent Kane, who's a sort of a hometown hero down there in Philadelphia. So that last chapter circles back to the issue of British respect. So to summarize this talk, the federal government really has been deeply invested in various forms of global expansion and global empire long before the late 19th century. And explorationists reimagined and repackaged an imperial tool from Europe, naval exploration. And they gradually assembled a pretty influential domestic coalition and pursued a diverse set of imperial influences around the world in the early republic in the pursuit of both prestige abroad and many other objectives beside. And the results of these activities bolstered a sense of U.S. nationalism on the eve of the U.S. Civil War. They forged a global empire of commerce in the Pacific world. And then they also helped to raise an imperial hierarchy at home. And it's one that we're still trying to dismantle today. Thank you very much. I hope you have questions for me.
Michael, thank you so much for that presentation. I know I have a lot of thoughts brewing as well, but we have a few minutes for questions. So please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to type them in the chat or in the Q&A. We do have one question from David, who's asking, are there any recent studies of the involvement of commercial brackets, private or governmental naval interests in the 19th century colonization movements? And he's specifically asking about Liberia and the attempt to colonize African Americans to Liberia.
Great. Yeah. Okay. There's two scholars I'll highlight. One is Brandon Mills at the University of Denver. He has a wonderful book. What's it called? The World That Colonization Made. And he talks a little bit about the Navy in that book. So there is that. I'd recommend that. And then also my friend Roger Bailey, who's currently a fellow at the Battlefield Trust. He is going to be coming out hopefully soon with an article on that subject. He has a wonderful dissertation about the antebellum Navy and the issue of race in the early republic, and paying very close attention to things like the African Squadron and to things like Liberia and the colonizationist movement. So I'm eagerly awaiting the publication of that book, and it sounds like David would be too. But those would be two scholars that I would immediately look for. There's an older book. I think it's Donald Canny has a book on the African Squadron, and I forget when that was published now at the top of my head. But it was something that I was reading when I was doing my dissertation research, and that's probably the best current study that we have if you're interested in just sort of the naval dimension of the maritime dimension of Liberia. So thank you for the question.
Okay, well, I have one other question. Well, I have a couple actually. First of all, I'm really curious about you're talking a lot about the American explorationist movement, and I'm curious about, and you're talking about it in this period, which is like a very intense international competition.
Yeah.
So I can imagine, are the guys in the Admiralty in London or in the Spanish courts or in Paris, are they freaking out about this? Are they worried about the Americans in Fiji, or is it kind of like welcome to the club?
Great. That's great. Yeah. Well, there is certainly some progress in terms of from if you're an explorationist, in terms of some recognition. Charles Wilkes does get a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society, so that's a pretty big deal. In some ways, he's feted a little bit more in Britain than he is at home, which is partly why he sets out to create this. He was the commander of the United States Exploring Expedition, I should clarify. He set out to create that Natural History Museum. Basically, the predecessor for the Smithsonian is in the 1840s and early 1850s, and it's called the National Gallery. So he gets some recognition. I was very surprised that the expedition to the Dead Sea under William Francis Lynch, he's a colonizationist, by the way, to David's earlier question. He leads one to West Africa. There's not a lot that's published on that, but he leads a little exploring expedition to West Africa. But nonetheless, I was surprised that he really didn't get much recognition at all. Maybe because it's cutting too close to home, because the British have too many of their own, especially imperial interest in that part of the world of Egypt and the route to India, that they're not going to trumpet what the Americans are doing there quite as much. They don't like, they do, there is some outcry over the Navy's Amazon expedition to try to expand slavery there. So there certainly is that. But all of that ends up being drowned out when the Navy goes up to the Arctic to try to rescue this lost British explorer. I think you can imagine the effusion of praise and celebration and an awful lot of toasting that happens in the British Isles in regards to the United States partaking in this humanitarian quest as they understand it. So the last chapter of the book, something suggests that they come very close to attaining that the kind of recognition they were initially seeking in the 1820s and even early 18 teens.
Fascinating. Are there any more questions from our attendees here? Well, if not, I just want to thank Michael again so much for a fascinating presentation. I have a million thoughts relating to my own work. Especially about what you were just saying with the Amazon expedition. We should definitely talk about that. But thank you so much for presenting on your work, and thank you so much for Allison at the Library Company for hosting this. I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and go Phillies.
Okay, it was such a pleasure. Thank you all so much.